Okay, great.
It's preparing to leave live stream the meeting, I think in less than 1 minute.
Okay, great.
It's preparing to. Okay, we should be aligned now. We usually wait 1-2 minutes. Okay, we should be aligned now.
Yes, we are. We are alive. So, but maybe start from not sharing the screen, right? So,
Pardon, what?
I was suggesting that we can start the session from not from your shared screen.
Oh, okay. So I'll stop the share.
Yeah, I guess that's better.
Okay.
And then after everything is introduced, everyone.
No, Dina, I love that pottery. I pass through the Jemez Pueblo a couple of times a year because I've family in New Mexico. An amazing place.
Mm-hmm. I love New Mexico.
Maybe for the people who are already watching, we can say that we're gonna start within a few minutes. And thank you for connecting. For people who are already watching, we're gonna start in 1-2 minutes. Thank you for start to watching and connecting on YouTube, live streaming. think we can start. Um, well, let's start, dear all. I want to give a very warm welcome to this second lecture, third lecture in our Radical Environmental Humanities series with Dina Gilio-Whitaker. My name is Gilio-Whitaker, and I am a member of the collective Resistance, a journal of Radical Environmental Humanities. I am coordinating this lecture with David Pello from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Nuno Marques from the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. And this lecture series is hosted by Resistance and History Institute for the History of Science at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. David will introduce our guest speaker today, and Nuno will say a few words about the lecture series. I will take a moment to introduce the journal, but first of all, let me thank you very much, Dina, and all of you, all our speakers for generously accepting our invitation, and all of you for watching. So Resistant is a relatively new journal. Previously was titled Resilience, and then recently Marco Armiero changed its name when he became editor-in-chief to reflect a new intellectual and political agenda. While resilience focuses on enduring stresses and returning to a prior state, resistance is about fighting back and changing the conditions that cause crisis. The aim of the journal is to become a reference point for radical scholarship in environmental humanities. Radical environmental humanities include any approach that questions the current state of society and academia, and stands in solidarity with grassroots movements and oppressed subjects, and contribute to research fostering more just socio-ecological relationships. For us, radicality is a starting point for a collective quest. And this lecture, these third lectures of our series, is part of our shared research journey. Thank you for listening. And again, let's start, and I will give the floor to Nuno now.
Thank you, Lizzie. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this third lecture. So just a brief words about this lecture series to say that they are a lecture series on radical environmental humanities taking place once a month from September. We started in September this year to June 2025. They will bring together a community of radical scholars, we hope, to share ideas, stories, and dreams for the world we so desperately need. We aim to contribute to the collective quest to reinvent and reenact radical environmental humanities. So our ambition is to create a community of practices and solidarity rather than a fixed canon, because for us, radicality is always a quest, a horizon, a collective and unresolved question about ourselves and our commitment to change the world. So we are happy that such incredible speakers accepted to be part of the series, and we invite you to their coming lectures. So let me just say the future lectures, which will take place on December 19 with Giovanna Di Ciro, January 21st, so next year, Malcolm Ferdinand, February 11, Nidvedita Menon, March 18, Eric Swingadau, and April 10, Mimo Basse, May 20, Stefania Barca, and June 25, Raul Zibecki. Like Lizzie said, you can find the lecture program series with detailed information in the Facebook page of the Resistance Journal and at the webpage of the Institute for the History of Science at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So now I give the floor to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuno and Lizzie. It's wonderful to be here. My name is David Pello, and I also serve on the editorial collective of Resistance. I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker. Dina Gilio-Whitaker of the Colville Confederated Tribes is a lecturer in American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and an independent educator and advisor on indigenous environmental issues. She is a much sought-after speaker and is addressed and advised on a wide range of academic disciplines and organizations in the realms of conservation, law, science, government, outdoor sports, and more. As a freelance journalist, her work has appeared in Indian Country Today, the Los Angeles Times, High Country News, Sierra Magazine, Time.com, Slate, Pioneers, Truth Out, Grist, the Boston Globe, and many, many more. She has won numerous awards for her writing, including awards from the Native American Journalists Association. Her research interests focus on indigenous nationalism, self-determination, environmental justice, and education. For several years, she has been involved with Indigenous peoples' participation in the United Nations. She also works within the academic field of critical sports studies, examining the intersections of indigeneity and the sport of surfing. In 2016, she published a book along with co-author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz titled All the Real Indians Died Off, and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. One of her most recent books is the critically acclaimed and award-winning As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. Dina is working on a number of additional books, a couple of which are Illegitimate Nation, Privilege, Race, and Belonging in the U.S. Settler State. I believe these are working titles. And Claiming Native, Authenticity, Ethnic Fraud, and the Messy Ambiguity of Native Identity. So much more to come from our speaker. Today, she will be lecturing, giving a talk on Beyond Leopold and Momaday, an Indigenous feminist view of a relational land ethic. So please join me in welcoming Dina Gilio-Whitaker. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you, David. Once again, you hit it out of the park with that generous introduction. And we've done this before. I was at Santa Barbara earlier this year at I think David had a lot to do with that invitation, but it was a really lovely time, and it's really great to be doing this again with you. Before I go further, I'll introduce myself properly by saying Wahe Pisnak Siluch Isquis Dina Gilio-Whitaker, Hassalhal Piayat Utl Is and Kailu Squeezed Silwait. And that's just an introduction of myself in my tribal language, which is Insukchin, and just telling you who I am and greeting you as a group. So I'm again happy to be here. I am, as David said, a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes, the Okanagan and Sinixt bands. So that is my positionality in the place where I come from in my work. What I'm going to do, so before I share my screen, I think what I'll do is I wanted to share also sort of the backstory of this paper that and how it came to be. And it started with a writing group, kind of a small writing and discussion group that I was in with Kyle White, Priscilla Ibarra, Julianne Warren, and a few others whose names you would recognize and who I'm drawing a blank on right now, unfortunately, but people who are important scholars in the space of the environmental humanities. And we formed this group which lasted for several months with the idea for a possible book, an anthology that tackles the topic of Aldo Leopold and the space that he holds in the world of environmental humanities. And of course, in our little group, we were coming from a sort of a counter narrative perspective. We all know that Aldo Leopold is widely hailed and venerated as the father of a modern environmental ethic, and that's how he's gone down in the literature. And but from an Indigenous perspective, there are huge problems with that. And Kyle White really has been the one who's written probably the most cogently about it and saliently about it. And so, I was definitely inspired by that. But for me, as a feminist, as an Indigenous feminist scholar, I have an added sort of layer of analysis there, and that's really where this is coming from. So I just wanted to share that. I was able to think alongside some really, really important scholars, and this is a really good time to thank them for that intellectual, companionship and labor and allyship. So that's the backstory. And with that, what I'm going to do is share the screen now and get started. So again, I'm going to apologize. I'm reading a paper. It's not something I normally do when I present. But with this one, I'm more comfortable. There's so much nuance to it. I'm more comfortable reading this paper, but feel free to take notes and jot down your thoughts for discussion for later. Okay, so Momaday, beyond Leopold and Momaday, an Indigenous feminist view of a relational land ethic. In the worlds of the environmental humanities and conservation, the concept of the land ethic, as articulated by Aldo Leopold in his classic Sand County Almanac, looms large, having become canonical environmental philosophy. Kiowa literary icon N. Scott Momaday, on the other hand, also wrote about an American Indian conception of land ethics that has gotten less attention and was based on a dramatically different epistemological foundation than Leopold's. While Leopold's approach has been considered revolutionary, it lacked the depth and a much broader relational worldview than that articulated by Momaday and so many other American Indian writers. At the same time, it's notable that both Leopold and Momaday largely failed to contextualize and imagine an American land ethic that accounts for the U.S. history of environmental injustice against American Indians. As I have argued elsewhere, the U.S. history of genocide and land theft constitutes a very particular experience of environmental injustice compared to that of other environmental justice communities. This paper argues that an American land ethic that is silent on Indigenous eradication and expulsion is problematic at best, and at worst perpetuates the eliminative impulse of the U.S. settler state. I make the case that any U.S. land ethic must reckon with U.S. settler history and ongoing genocidal structure to incorporate an ethic of justice that acknowledges, one, the endurance of Indigenous nationhood culturally and politically, and two, Indigenous land management practices that historically and currently animate their ethical commitments to the natural world, abbreviated as traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. In this way, an American land ethic can be transformational by bridging the gap between environmental ethics and environmental justice, and by being responsive to both the natural world and human communities in the US. As I build my argument for transformational land ethic through my positionality as an affirmed Indigenous feminist, I will discuss the ways Leopold and Momaday wrote about their land ethics ideas, how discourses of environmental ethics and justice diverge and converge, how discourses of Native American land ethics are best theorized in conjunction with conversations about Indigenous land management practices, and conclude by envisioning a possible framework for a transformational land ethic. Okay, this topic heading is an Indigenous feminism and relationality. My comparison of Leopold and Momaday is shaped by my identity as a Native woman and confirmed Indigenous feminist committed to decolonization in all the various ways that we can define it, and all the ways we have yet to. At the core of what I'm arguing for in this paper is how we can engage Leopold and Momaday's land ethic ideas in ways that are radically more relational than either of them conceived of. Although some American Indian women over the course of the years or over the years have contested the concept of indigenous feminism, arguing that, quote, Indian women do not need liberation. They have always been liberated within their tribal structure, unquote. Others have rightly argued that colonialism brought with it patriarchal systems previously unknown in our societies. Annette Jaimes Guerrero refers to native womanism to describe the kinds of kinship relations that construct tribal societies, which she says also has an ecological dimension, which can be seen in female organic archetypes. Oops, I'm gonna switch the slide here. So female organic archetypes within indigenous origin stories. Examples would include Pueblo corn mother stories, Navajo spider woman and changing woman stories, sky woman of the Haudenosaunee and other Eastern European peoples, white buffalo calf woman of the Lakota, and many others. Patriarchal colonialism as a system of genocide and ecocide can thus be viewed as an interrelated matrix of, quote, feminized subordination of nature, natives, and women, a manifestation of the denigration of the female principle. And this engendered female principle of subordination can be contextualized as strands in the web of imperialism, unquote. Sorry, I don't have my footnotes for who said that. So this will be a little disjointed. Okay, acknowledging that the entanglements of patriarchy, colonialism, and ecocide as gendered processes is a necessary first step in regenerating indigenous relationality in its gendered articulations. Leopold and Momaday are both products of particular times and places in which neither are immune from patriarchal colonialism. While a complete feminist analysis of both these figures is beyond the scope of this essay and unnecessary to its thesis linking indigenous relationality to an expanded and transformational land ethic, such analyses would be useful to the exposure and entangling of these patriarchal colonial processes in their temporally specific sites. Feminist perspectives on Leopold are quite limited, but at least one ecofeminist analysis suggests that Leopold can be seen as unwittingly promoting an attitude of domination toward the non-human world. It is a risky and unpopular business to critically interrogate widely beloved cultural heroes, especially in the environmental and American Indian worlds, by quote, contradicting prevailing institutional logics that at best can only serve to assimilate women into destructive ways of being, unquote. But given the deeply entrenched nature of patriarchy, even Momaday's work should not escape scrutiny, just as other prominent male American Indian leaders have not. Complicating Leopold and Momaday doesn't mean we don't continue to acknowledge both men for the ways their work has advanced important social narratives and policies, and it doesn't assume that their perspectives were equally patriarchal. But it does mean that by contributing to an indigenous feminist perspective, we are able to build upon and strengthen the work they started and emphasize relationality in ways they didn't or perhaps couldn't. Okay, now a discussion on Leopold and Momaday. Environmentalists and conservationists alike are familiar to one degree or another with the life and work of Aldo Leopold, one of the most revered figures in the world of environmental humanities and philosophy. His posthumously published book, Sand County Almanac, and the essay, The Land Ethic in particular, has become foundational to the worlds of environmental studies and activism and scholarship. His work has become institutionalized in the family-run Aldo Leopold Foundation, a conservation nonprofit located in the Baraboo Mountains of Wisconsin on the property of the Leopold family home in the ancestral territory of the Ho-Chunk Nation. The foundation has numerous educational programs that appeal to a wide range of people, from children to adults, academics to lay people, including a Land Steward Fellowship, Education and Communications Fellowship, and a Writer in Residence program in northern New Mexico at the former home of Aldo Leopold and his wife, Estella. Leopold's published and unpublished work are archived on the Foundation's website. At least 2 films have been made about Leopold, including the documentary Aldo Leopold, Learning from the Land, which first aired on PBS in 1999, and Green Fire, Aldo Leopold and a Land Ethic for Our Time, released in 2011 and considered by the International Society for Environmental Ethics to be the first full-length documentary on Aldo Leopold. Numerous books, of course, have been written on Leopold, and for some scholars, Leopold formed the foundation of their academic or writing careers. The Leopold legacy has become, in a sense, an industry with the Leopold Foundation at the center, and it has had an outsized influence in conservation and environmental studies. N. Scott Momaday is one of the most widely celebrated American literary luminaries of the 20th century. Although he has written dozens of books, plays, and poems, he is also an exceptionally accomplished academic, having earned tenure at 4 R1 universities. He has been the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including a Pulitzer, the National Medal of Arts, a Guggenheim, many honorary doctorates, and more. He too wrote an essay on land ethics. In reality, however, the American Indian ethical relationship to the land is infused throughout all his writings. All his writing, yes. His American land ethic was first penned circa 1971 and then later published in the 1997 book The Man Made of Words: Essays, Stories, Passages. An abbreviated version appeared again in an edited volume in 2010. Both men's land ethic ideas exist within particular temporal contexts when American narratives about American Indian people reflected popular attitudes and contemporaneous federal Indian policy spanning a period of most of the 20th century, a time when those narratives and policies underwent dramatic shifts. The turn of the century came on the heels of the cessation of the so-called Indian Wars, with Native people only recently militarily confined to reservations under conditions that closely resembled prison camps. With Indians now safely contained and no longer a threat to the white supremacy-driven U.S. expansionist project, Americans went from fear and open hatred of Indians to lamenting the closing of the frontier and the supposed disappearance of the continent's original people. With them was the perceived loss of what made the U.S. unique and the freedom that Americans simultaneously desired and were repulsed by, in the words of Philip Deloria in 1999 in his book, Playing Indian. The first Hollywood films notoriously featured highly romanticized themes of the vanishing Indian, a trope that had been common throughout the 19th century literature and other popular cultural forms. Meanwhile, the federal government would continue attempting to disappear Indians who had long since been rendered inferior both culturally and legally by converting them into white people through the 1887 Dawes Act mandate to assimilate them via church-run boarding schools and allotment of communally held tribal lands. Considered progressive policy in its day, the cruelty and injustice that defined centuries of American settler history was now fully institutional and normalized, burned into the consciousness of settlers in the name of God, civilization, and progress. Okay, so Leopold, a little more on Leopold. Aldo Leopold was born the year the Dawes Act was passed, educated at Yale, and began his career with the Forest Service during its tenure. The law was not officially overturned until 1934. The Dawes Act circumscribed the federal government's official Indian policy of forced assimilation. This would be achieved through a government boarding school program and the allotment of communally held reservation lands into individual plots, but in the end was a massive land grab through the taking of surplus lands, quote unquote. Leopold was working in the federal land management sector at the time when the US was engaged in the legalized theft of 90 million acres of treaty reserved Indian lands that the Dawes Act authorized through its allotment policy. It is not unreasonable to presume that Leopold was aware that the US was acquiring massive tracts of land at the expense of tribes. The inevitability of Indian disappearance due to belief in their lack of civilization and the ideology of manifest destiny was a given in fin de siècle America, or turn of the century America. And Leopold was not immune from this view. Like much recent commentary on the supposed evolution of John Muir's racist views, from whom even the Sierra Club distanced themselves in 2020 after the Black Lives Matter uprising because of Muir's well-known bigotry. Leopoldian scholars have also argued that Leopold's views on American Indians changed throughout the course of his life, and that this change was eventually reflected in the land ethic essay. To environmental ethicists like Callicott, Leopold's land ethic was striking for the ways his own understanding of ecology science had changed throughout his Forest Service career and evolved in an albeit quote unquote amateur philosophical sensibility. But what has garnered the most attention is a shift in the ways that he perceived the natural world, in which he describes nature as more than just resources. He invests these resources with a degree of agency when he, quote, affirms their right to continued existence and, at least in spots, in their natural state, unquote. In the next paragraph, Leopold, I think that quote was from Callicott. Again, sorry, I don't have my footnotes with me. In the next paragraph, Leopold characterizes the biotic world's relationship to humans in terms of community. Quote, in short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also a respect for the community as such. That was a quote from Leopold in the essay. Much has been written about Leopold's use of the terms plain member citizen and community to describe what is the heart of this land ethic. And some have interpreted this apparent evolution in thought from a quote from youthful resource manager to environmental sage, unquote, to his early career time in the American Southwest and the imagined influence of American Indians on his thinking. We might call this the Leopoldian Native American influence theory. In one of the earlier articulations of this theory, Callicott and Nelson compared Leopold's views on the biotic community to Ojibwe environmental ethics through the lens of their relations to the animal world, framed as communities, and also by addressing skeptics who denied the existence of American Indian land ethics. To be fair, Callicott and Nelson's work is less an attempt to explain that Leopold was influenced by American Indians than simply to argue that they were comparable. The assertion of the influence theory is most strenuously made by Dan Schilling in a 2009 essay titled Aldo Leopold Listens to the Southwest. In the essay, Schilling argues that the trajectory of Leopold's philosophy exhibits a later third path and a radical center where land use and preservation intersect, a state of harmony between men and the land. From there, based largely on anecdotal evidence, Schilling speculates that Leopold would have had interactions with Indians in Arizona and New Mexico that managed to infiltrate his consciousness enough to produce this emergent third path. Yet Schilling admits that Leopold only infrequently acknowledges any debt to earlier Southwest cultures of the Southwest, and that If a 3-month research trip to Germany could transform his perspective on land use, as scholars tend to accept, then it's worth conjecturing a similar Southwest influence. Schilling offers no concrete evidence from Leopold's archives or elsewhere, however, that shows any interactions with Indians that we could irrefutably identify as having a significant impact on Leopold's land ethic ideas. One aspect of Leopold's life that is ripe for analysis and debate is the fact that Leopold married into one of the oldest Hispano settler families in New Mexico. Aldo's wife, Estela Luna Otero Berger, was an heiress descended from old Spanish sheep-herding families, the so-called Luna Otero dynasty, who have roots in the conquistador era after the expelling of the Spanish with the revolt, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. The Lunas arrived in 1692 with the Spanish returnees or reconquerors and became recipients of the San Clemente land grant in today's Valencia County, just south of Albuquerque in the traditional territory of Tiwa Indians and today's Isleta Pueblo. The Oteros arrived a few years later, and the Luna and Otero families intermarried in the late 1800s. The history of Spanish conquest and Spanish and Mexican land grabs and later American colonization represents 3 separate eras of colonial violence against indigenous peoples in what is today New Mexico that shaped prevailing regional attitudes toward the Indian populations, with all the attendant justifications for the taking of land. To this day, New Mexico is the site of highly contested land claims and bitter memories due to the complexities of these colonial histories. How might the influence of the Hispano family Aldo Leopold married into have affected his views toward Indians during his time in New Mexico in ways that were less than altruistic? What were Estela's views and influence inherited from centuries of complex family interactions with Indians? Work in progress from feminist environmental scholar and personal friend Priscilla Ibarra promises to shed more light on this history and these relations. Potawatomi environmental philosopher Kyle Powers-White has pushed back on the Leopoldian Native American influence theory. He challenges the theory with an unpublished, but actually I think maybe it's published now, but publicly available essay titled "How Similar Are Indigenous North American and Leopoldian Environmental Ethics?" White asserts that while there is a valid potential for making these comparisons, in the long run, the effort to conflate Leopold's land ethic with American Indian land ethics risks critical misunderstandings between them. Um, Among those misunderstandings White identifies are: one, that Leopold's model of environmental stewardship would not be one that Indigenous people would identify with. Two, that Leopold's ethics is a settler narrative that fundamentally opposes Indigenous ethics. And three, that it sets up Leopold in the objectionable position of interpreter and translator of Indigenous ethics. For White, the attempts to blend land ethic traditions across lines they cross lines that shouldn't be crossed and is simply not necessary. There is more utility in comparing the land ethics in order to critically distinguish their differences rather than to attempt to equate them. Another layer of inquiry from an Indigenous feminist perspective could proceed with questions about how presumptions that conflate Leopold's land ethic with Indigenous land ethics undermine woman-centered origin stories, such as the Sky Woman story of the Potawatomi and Haudenosaunee. To what extent does incorrectly equating Leopold's land ethic with Indigenous land ethics reinscribe male settler logics rooted in patriarchal colonialism? Momaday and comparisons. While on the surface, Momaday's land ethic may resemble Leopold's, in actuality, they are worlds apart. Flowing from an Indigenous storytelling tradition, Momaday articulates this land ethic through the telling of an epiphany he had at the end of writing The Way to Rainy Mountain. in the essay, he immediately grounds himself within a Kiowa worldview in which relationship to place is what defines Kiowa existence, and coincidentally never mentions Leopold's work, which I find interesting. In this framework, ancestors are inseparable from that relationship, illustrated in the story of the respected female elder Kosan, whose relationship to the land is characterized in terms of racial memory. Quote, he says, for her, there were no distinctions between the individual and the racial experience, even as there was none between the mythical and the historical. Both were realized for her in the one memory, and that was of the land. Quote, close quote. Here, I am neither accepting nor discounting the idea of memory as racial, i.e., biologically determined, but cite the passage to emphasize the difference in relationship to land between Leopold and Momaday, or more broadly, settler and indigenous. It is also curious that in the invoking of Kosan, Momaday would choose to emphasize race as his analytic, seemingly downplaying the cultural and gendered aspect of Kosan as a sacred grandmother. Through the story of Kosan, told as something of a preface to his unfolding land ethic thoughts, Momaday also invokes the sun dance, probably as another way to differentiate the Kiowa relationship to land from that of settlers, but in which the interconnectedness of the land with the cosmos is an iteration of the sacred. Quote, the sun dance was an essential expression of her relationship to the life of the earth and to the sun and moon. The Kiowa relationship to land is thus understood in unquestionably spiritual terms. Curiously, Momaday's thoughts about an American land ethic then unfold under a banner of, quote, we Americans who need now more than ever, and indeed more than we know, to imagine who and what we are with respect to the earth and sky, unquote. He points out that, quote, our whole experience as a nation in this country has been a repudiation of the pastoral ideal, which informs so much of the art and literature of the 19th century. One effect of the technological revolution has been to uproot us from the soil. We have become disoriented, I believe. We have suffered a kind of psychic dislocation of ourselves in time and space, unquote. Here, he collapses all people in the US into the subjective category Americans, without distinctions between specific populations whose histories and relationship to the state are vastly different, especially those of American Indians and settlers. It is unclear who the us is that have been uprooted from the soil, but presumably it is most everyone. But we might speculate that it is Indians through colonialism and settlers through urbanization, technology, and the capitalist private property regime. There is even a gesture to highly romanticize 19th century literature, quote, the pastoral ideal, unquote, raising troubling connections to the trope of indigenous disappearance as the policies of manifest destiny which drove the technological revolution he refers to, and left in its wake massive destruction for American Indians. Momaday believes that most Americans, quote unquote, are indifferent to the land, but that a land ethic is at least dormant. He sprinkles his thoughts about the land ethic with references to Kosan, quote, and in her people, we have always had the example of a deep ethical regard for the land. We had better learn from it, unquote. Strangely, he seems to distance himself from this person who he had spoken of earlier as a relative, as though he were now just American, not Kiowa. The story of Kosan also illustrates the ways indigenous peoples' relationship to land has been profoundly altered through historical political processes Momaday chooses not to name. Additionally, nowhere in the essay does Momaday indicate that there are, either in 1971 when the essay first was written or in 1997 when it was published, indigenous communities and individuals still holding down traditional lives, still keeping alive earth-based ceremonial and land management practices rooted solidly in a very different relationship to the land from dominant settler society. This is especially strange given the many years Momaday has lived in the Southwest, surrounded by a very traditional Pueblo and Navajo communities. Reading Momaday's essay through a feminist lens would mean emphasizing the need to restore an indigenous kin-centric orientation against the habits of settler-imposed patriarchy, which in this case uncritically assumes Native people are subsumed into U.S. subjectivity. We know from Momaday's massive body of work that he believes in the difference in worldviews between settler and indigenous. Schweninger in 2008, for example, emphasizes this in his analysis of Momaday while arguing the larger point that Momaday's views do not equate to the problematic trope of the Indian as the original environmentalist. Echoing the language in An American Land Ethic, Schweninger affirms that for Momaday, the Indian's relationship to land is both animated and circumscribed by imagination, story, and language. For Leopold, on the other hand, it is based on an arguably settler-based idea of community that includes an affective element. The land is a community, that the land is a community is a basic concept of ecology, but that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. And that's a direct quote from Leopold. Leopold's land ethic, in other words, arguably amounts to an intellectual pursuit in order to support settler society's preservation of a disappearing, socially constructed wilderness and to alter hunting and farming practices that are having detrimental ecological impacts. At most, it approaches or approximates an indigenous conception of relationship to land, but is in no way equivalent to it. I'm going to check my slides out here. I don't know where I was supposed to. Okay, and I'm going to go back. Environmental ethics and environmental justice. That there is at least one definitive environmental American Indian land ethic, a la Momaday, and that it emerges from a different epistemological and ontological orientation to the world compared to Leopold's is clear. What is also clear, however, is that for neither of these men is a set of ethics guiding human relationships to land tied to a sense of ethical behavior between human populations, in this case, colonizer to colonized. This is surprising, especially in the case of Momaday, given that the ancient ethics-based land practices that ensured the health of ecosystems and thus the sustainability of hundreds of cultures for millennia were severely impacted through centuries of aggressive invasion. Leopold does invoke an abstracted idea of human conquest as an analog for his way of perceiving the human-nature relationship. Quote, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member citizen of it, unquote. But he does so in a way that does not acknowledge the US's actual foundation of colonial conquest. It is similar to Momaday's Americanizing conflation of settler and indigenous populations in that both are decoupled from the centuries of violent impositions that resulted in the types of settler land use that has led to the conditions of environmental degradation that necessitate a conversation about land ethics to begin with. Overall, it is settler society that causes this cascade of environmental destruction, not native. The elision of human justice in land ethics discourse is as evidenced through Leopold and Momaday reflect what some see as a tendency in environmental humanities more broadly. Jerome Ballet and Damien Bazin in 2017 specifically argue that a gap exists between the fields of environmental ethics and environmental justice, and look to the work of German-American philosopher Hans Jonas as an example of someone whose work analytically bridges the gap. Ballet and Bazin contend that environmental ethics and justice movements converge through the concept of responsibility. Not only do humans have a responsibility to nature, but a responsibility to each other as a matter of morals. While the analytic terrain they traversed to reach their conclusion is based on a different epistemological foundation, for one thing, they focus particularly on economic considerations, but more, they never mention the colonial histories of states like the US. It nonetheless rightly links nature with human relationships to each other. It also resonates with American Indian epistemologies that revolve around relationality and reciprocity, and what Gregory Cajete calls natural laws of interdependence, or what Kimmerer characterizes as gifting economies within cultures of reciprocity. To compare land ethics without factoring in the human historical processes that led to such dramatic changes in land use over time evades a much larger picture about the nature of the capitalist neoliberal US settler state. The result of keeping land ethics separated from processes of justice in the US is the perpetuation of patterns whereby one, settler society remains unaccountable for its history of genocide and land theft, and two, indigenous peoples' deliberate and intelligent management of land remains relegated to romanticized notions of, in quotes here, indigenous wisdom, folklore, spirituality, or even culture, unquote, rather than intelligible systems of legitimate evidence-based knowledge from which Western scientists can benefit in equitable partnerships to address critical environmental problems. Okay, next topic section is from indigenous wisdom to intelligent land management. Since the late 20th century, a growing body of literature has attempted to grapple with conflicting views about environmentally related knowledge production. If we think of this kind of knowledge production on a spectrum, we might think of Western science on one end and indigenous epistemologies, TEK in particular, on the other. Historically, Western science has imagined itself as being the sole source of legitimate knowledge through which solutions to difficult environmental problems can be conceived. The life's work of Aldo Leopold provides a perfect example of this kind of binary Eurocentric thinking. In this paradigm, indigenous societies who are at a lower rung of civilizational evolution because they did not use the land in the kinds of technology intensive and economically driven ways Europeans did, are incapable of producing true scientific knowledge. In the social landscape of the US, views about American Indians began shifting with the emergence of the 1960s counterculture, inspiring the Back to the Land movement that was simultaneously informed by red power activism and mainstream conservationism. It was reflected in a wide variety of popular culture representations and literature written by authentic American Indians and frauds alike. Notably, Vine Deloria released his landmark first book, Custer Died for Your Sins, An Indigenous Manifesto in 1969. The same year, Momaday was awarded a Pulitzer for Housemaid of Dawn. It is also the temporal and social context within which Momaday first wrote his land ethic. A year earlier, Carlos Castaneda released the first book of the wildly popular but notoriously deceitful series on what turned out to be a fake Yaqui shaman named Don Juan Matus. For the first time in history, Indians were now on the radar as more than just obstacles to American progress, and a new sense of respect was accorded to them, even if in fraudulent and inappropriate ways. Americans were particularly attracted to the Indians' relationship to nature as a way to think through growing environmental problems. And like earlier literary tropes, the new representations of Indians were typically highly romanticized. Indians were viewed as living in quote, harmony and balance, quote unquote, with the land, as having wisdom that settlers lacked. They were projected as the US's original or proper environmentalists. As Nicole Sturgeon in 2009 writes, no image more powerfully illustrates this projection than Iron Eyes Cody in the 1971 Crying Indian commercial by the Keep America Beautiful Inc. campaign, which was just a recasting of the noble savage trope of earlier eras. And not only is white settler supremacy on display here through the convoluted casting of the noble savage as a hero, it is in a very gendered way. It is in a very gendered way. Heroes are always male. In general, however, settler society's late 20th century popular culture fixation on Native peoples' environmentalism was ambiguous and not taken seriously as legitimate systems of knowledge on par with Western scientific knowledge. Instead, these cultural texts emphasize Native spirituality, a view of nature as sacred, a quality missing in mainstream settler religion, and which was desperately desired and then appropriated in the counterculture and blossoming second wave environmental movement, which were precursors to the highly exploitative New Age industry. Schweninger provides an example of this religiosity in his discussion about the pervasiveness of Mother Earth narratives in a wide variety of texts, both native and non-native, which, along with the land ethic, he characterizes as a stereotype. None of this is to suggest that literature focusing on indigenous spirituality relating to land use or ethics is in any way incorrect or inappropriate. It is only to bring to light patterns of thought that habitually confine native land-based knowledge to the realms of religion or philosophy, not science, thereby diminishing the intellectual importance and utility of the land management practices that made indigenous cultures sustainable for millennia. Ramos, a Northern California indigenous woman scholar in 2018, on the other hand, tracks a parallel literature in the wildlife conservation world where she identifies TEK emerging in anthropology studies as early as the 1950s and claims that by the 1980s, the term TEK was widespread. She identifies distinctions between Western and indigenous scientific paradigms where, quote, knowledge production in Western science is considered legitimate and professional in a distinct social system and institutionalized framework, unquote. And in order to be credible, it must follow scientific method. She reminds readers that the social system was a colonial one, characterized by a harsh legal system designed to disempower tribal nations. At the same time, she points out that there are many philosophies of science, American Indian TEK being one. As an aspect of indigenous science, and one of the things that distinguishes it from Western science is that it does not compartmentalize knowledge, making the terms knowledge and science interchangeable. Indigenous science then is holistic and inseparable from spirituality, which poses further problems for Western scientists. For these reasons, Ramos suggests ways researchers and conservation managers can learn to be more culturally sensitive and avoid reinscribing the colonial relationship in their work with Native people through a decolonizing approach. There are examples of TEK being enacted in reservation and other Native communities too numerous to name. And Ramos's work demonstrates ways it is negotiated in non-tribal contexts. Additionally, Frank Long et al. In 2020 discussed ways TEK is employed in ecosystem restoration as cultural land management practitioners within the U.S. Forest Service, and point out the benefits for Native and non-Native people alike, and recognizing that more research needs to be done. And here's a fairly lengthy quote from that study. Greater understanding of the connections between ancestral traditions and ecological outcomes could help both Native and non-Native communities to establish more mutualistic relationships with the lands upon which they depend. Many of our observations appear congruent with findings from a systemic review of restoration research that identifies strategies to effectively engage local communities. Systemic review of projects that have engaged tribes might help reveal factors that yield more beneficial restoration. Such reviews could be facilitated if there were more structured reporting of collaborative restoration projects that engage tribes. And that's the end of the quote. In the long run, though, what is apparent is that there is a trend where Indigenous knowledge is increasingly being taken seriously as indispensable in ecosystem management, and that Indigenous wisdom really translates into applied Indigenous scientific environmental knowledge. And here's my concluding paragraph or conclusion toward a transformational land ethic. An understanding of a land ethic that folds human justice into it would transcend the kind of compartmentalization that structures Western knowledge in general and settler U.S. society specifically. Bill Malassery, Pegways, and Goldstein in 2016 referred to this compartmentalization as, quote, an epistemological orientation that works to preempt relational modes of analysis, unquote, a process of colonial unknowing that perpetually reinforces a collective willful ignorance about the state's history of racialization and dispossession. In rendering visible this process, the authors destabilize binaries such as structure event, that is, settler colonialism is both the structure and event, and settler native, to restore ancient relational epistemologies as they have been inscribed geographically by Indigenous people through, for example, TEK practices, and think through decolonization beyond an imagined endpoint. In a similar vein, Mamdani contends that the violence of settler colonialism is not primarily social but political, a project of state formation that created permanent minorities, internal colonies, and ongoingly reinforces the settler native binary, that is, civilization slash savagery narratives. The problem is that justice for colonial violence, when it has been addressed at all, such as in Germany or South Africa, it has been approached administratively within a criminal justice paradigm rather than as embedded in political state systems, thus leaving the political roots of a structural, i.e., legalized violence intact. This then absolves the state of responsibility for violence. Conceiving of justice-oriented ethical relationships to land must thus consist of reframing narratives on the social level, as well as the political and policy levels, with the aim of accountability for historical and structural violence of the settler state and the upholding of tribal nationhood and self-determination. Reframing narratives must challenge the paradigms that insidiously reproduce settler supremacy and patriarchal colonialism and systematically avoids accountability in the name of progress and environmentalism. In the environmental humanities, this can begin with accepting the limitations of Leopold's land ethic and moving toward an expanded understanding of Momaday's, paying particular attention to Indigenous feminist perspectives and their decolonizing projects. Environmental humanities can also do better to incorporate Indigenous epistemologies alongside Western-based epistemologies, accepting them as legitimate systems of evidence and science-based knowledge expressed within political systems that governed land for millennia before European settlement. Greater recognition in the humanities would help bridge gaps between the social and hard sciences, as well as increasing the promotion of Indigenous epistemologies and state-based land management practices. Ultimately, the ideas of indigenous relationality and the Western concept of human responsibility to other humans are perfectly complementary to each other. They harmonize with the holistic nature of indigenous knowledge, as well as some trends toward holistic systems thinking in Western knowledge paradigms, such as the conservation and ecosystem restoration work discussed by Ramos and Long et al. We don't have to reach outside the box of a Western paradigm to see responsibility as connective tissue to indigenous relationality. Ecofeminist theory conceptually embraces TEK through an ethics of care and responsibility, quoting Joan McGregor here from 2018, and can intersectionally harmonize with principles of indigenous feminism through what Verbos and Humphreys in 2012 called logics of relation. Similarly, transformational sustainability studies literature is moving toward legitimizing human affectivity through care-based approaches to transformative change. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, for example, Maori scholars are imagining what legitimate belonging on the land might look like in the settler state through the lens of indigenous knowledge. By making these connections in the realm of environmental thought, we have the possibility of creating a model for settler society to draw upon more broadly as we collectively imagine what a decolonized society might look like. In these ways, we can envision a land ethic that is both transformational and accountable. And that's the conclusion. So I think what I'll do is stop the screen share. And now I can see everybody.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dina, for taking us through this exciting and rigorous journey through debates and key questions that are animating scholars across multiple fields, such as indigenous environmental studies, indigenous feminist theory, decolonial and literary scholarship, philosophy, ethics, political theory, history, environmental humanities, and much more. I think I'm just scratching the surface there. This was quite extraordinary. Thank you so much. I do want to say for members of our audience, if you are motivated to offer comments or questions, please do so on YouTube or Facebook, and Litzy and Nuno are helping gathering up those comments and questions. Let's see. So we will look forward to those. In the meantime, I will take the moderator's prerogative and get us started off. Dina, if I could just ask maybe what might for you be a basic question, but I think, starting from a foundation, I think the audience might want to just hear you say a little bit more about what it means to be an indigenous feminist scholar, and how that system of thought and knowledge and action might be different than other kinds of feminism, and why it's important to take that seriously as we should.
Right. Well, it begins from the perspective that not all feminisms are the same, right? That there are multiple feminisms. And if we follow the literature, feminist literature, through, for example, the waves theory, the theory that feminism, exists in certain, waves of eras. And different people will say different things, but say different. We are in different waves. Some will say we are in third wave feminism or fourth wave or maybe even a fifth wave. I don't know. It's not a solid, like not everybody agrees. But if we understand, feminism as we know it, or as it's written about or theorized, in mainstream academia, it's said to be, white feminism, right? Because the feminist movement begins in, the 1850s in New York, and and then that's first wave feminism, the suffrage movement. Then we get second wave feminism through the mid 20th century, and third wave feminism maybe in the 1980s, fourth wave in the 19, beyond that. So as feminist studies has progressed, especially through second wave feminism, that's when we see these different theories of feminism begin to diverge. And we begin to see it especially in Black studies, right? So we see the emergence of Black feminism with the Combahee River Statement in the 1970s. And then we see other feminisms of color begin to break off from, mainstream or white feminism, including, Chicana feminism and an indigenous feminism. And again, I want to stress that not all scholars, indigenous female scholars, agree to that, agree that there is such a thing or a need for indigenous feminism. But my argument is that, and that of others will say, is that it's true, in our indigenous societies, by and large, we don't never needed feminism because our societies were based uh, on gender equity, right? The balanced sharing of power, gendered power in our societies. So there was no need for a conversation. And incidentally, I want to also point out, this is something that maybe a lot of people don't know, but the work of Sally Roche Wagner was really revolutionized feminist theory when she identified that first wave feminists in the 1850s were likely very influenced by Native Americans because of their proximity to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Iroquois people, where there was, very pronounced gendered power balances, or balanced gender power. And so she wrote that probably she's convinced that, that's what the early first feminists, were modeling their feminism on, was, indigenous community gender balance. So anyway, um, native feminists or native female scholars will say, we don't need that because we already have it. But my argument is that we have all been impacted by colonialism. Colonialism dismantled, in many cases, our social norms that were based on that kind of gender equality and equity. So that's really the starting place for me.
Thank you. Thank you. And I really appreciate you laying out that important history and your positionality. And as you said, pointing out that there are these debates within Native American and indigenous communities around this question of feminism. That's something I'm quite certain not a lot of people are familiar with. So thank you for that. So in this work that you've presented today, you are as you said, you're taking on really these two giants, in their respective fields, Leopold and Momaday. And I wondered, I mean, continuing in some ways with the conversation about, what it means to be an indigenous feminist scholar, I'm wondering what kinds of pressures and tensions you are facing or maybe even expect to face. I'm not sure how far along this particular project is, but I'm just wondering what sorts of pressures you may be facing as an indigenous feminist scholar who's pushing back against these iconic figures, and what might we learn from some of those tensions and pressures?
Well, first of all, there is a real, there's a lot of contentiousness around critiques of Leopold. In this realm of, if we can call it, the Leopold industry. There has been a lot of debate back and forth, and I've been personally present to those debates in some very uncomfortable ways already, that I won't get into in depth because of the nature of the need for confidentiality. But I will say it's very difficult. It can be very difficult to push back against Leopold. Um, because people, there are so many people whose careers are invested in it, in, Leopoldian narratives. Um, but and then with the case of Momaday, I definitely, I'm nervous, like how people are going to respond to that. But I want, and I will say also that I intend to incorporate this research into one of the books that I'm, currently have in progress, the one called Illegitimate Nation. Um, so, but I also want to emphasize that I'm really not, I'm not trying to take them down. It's really about, I'm trying to engage collaboratively, critique, yes, but expand on, not tear it down. Like, there are ways to think through the work of both of these men that can expand on what they were saying, from their male perspectives. So that's really like, it's coming from a place of goodwill, not like, hostility.
Thank you. That's a really, really important lesson, I think, particularly for scholars and activists today, where we have such polarized and contentious engagements in so many nations right now. It's quite unfortunate.
Yeah.
I appreciate that approach. And yes, you were very clear about that in the presentation, really building on and extending their work. Well, we have a question from our editor-in-chief of the journal Resistance here, Marco Armiero, who's joined us. And that question is, could you comment on the potential for alliances between indigenous activism and other marginalized groups in resisting colonial and capitalist oppression?
Hmm. Yeah, that's going to be more and more important, won't it, in in the upcoming years, given our current state of affairs in the U.S. Well, and beyond too, with the intensification of authoritarianism worldwide, and then the accompanying resistance that will come with it. So, I would say that I'm really pleased to see more of this, especially in the last, few years. There are more and more examples of allyship and marginalized communities coming together in ways that maybe we've seen glimmers of in the past. But I think they need to intensify and build on each other. Of course, there's always been uh, you know, efforts for non-native, like, white communities to work in partnership with native communities. Sometimes they go well and sometimes they don't. Lots of examples of how they fall apart and become counterproductive. But I'm seeing more. I also think that there needs to be more collaboration between communities of color with indigenous populations, especially Black communities. And there has been, I think, in my observation, a lack of that, of land justice movements intersecting with indigenous issues. I think that those are, because we live in a settler colonial system. When we talk about land justice, it can't be ahistorical. So if you have, Black communities or other kinds of communities, Hispanic, whatever kinds of communities who are, marginalized communities, but still within the context of settler colonial private property logics, then there has to be another conversation about what that justice looks like in the big picture. Um, an uncomfortable example I'll bring up right now is a story that happened here in Southern California a few years ago with the return of Blacks, the Bruce's Beach case. So the land Bruce's Beach. David, I'm sure you're familiar with this story, but for those of you who are not, this during, shortly after the George Floyd incident, there was a movement that brought forth by Black communities in the community of Manhattan Beach. This is a site of a property that had been acquired by the Bruce family in 1912, around early 19th century, 20th century, during a time of segregation in Southern California. So, and a time when the population is blooming, especially coastal beachfront communities are popping up. And the Bruce family bought this property and built a beautiful resort for Black people, beachfront resort, and it was very popular for many years. But there was, a lot of racial tension in Southern California, and there was a successful effort to drive them out and take the land, and it was profoundly unjust. They had their land basically foreclosed on through eminent domain laws, and the land was stolen from them, just flat out. And so there, today, of course, that's the site of, some of the most expensive real estate in the world. After the George Floyd incident happened, there was a movement coming from the Black community to reclaim that land. Right now, that lot is an empty, it's a park. It's memorialized with a very large plaque there telling the story of Bruce's Beach. And so it's memorialized. But this movement of activists, worked to say, no, that land needs to be returned. This is a land justice issue. It needs to be returned. And so that was a very high profile case. But what happened in the debates and the very prolific news stories about that movement was that there was no engagement at all with the local native community, the Tongva people whose land that actually is. It was as though it were too much of a hot potato, and like we cannot possibly have that conversation. If we're talking about land justice for Black people, we can't like complicate that with, talking about, well, what about the original injustice? The original land theft was from the Tongva people. There was nobody willing to have that conversation. And although I know that there were local Tongva people who were trying to have that conversation, but they could not get their perspective. There were no journalists that were willing to, there was maybe one, but it wasn't a mainstream source. So it was completely ignored. And so this pattern of erasure of Indigenous perspectives was perpetuated in the name of, land justice for Black people. So this is an example of how that we need to have better alliances and better communication between our communities, to, if we're going to have really honest conversations and true partnerships with each other.
That's absolutely right. I thank you for sharing that. You're the expert on this, but I'll tell you, just from a pedestrian standpoint, having read a number of media stories about the Bruce Beach conflict, I could not agree with you more. I didn't see one single story with one single indication that, Native folks, Indigenous peoples had anything to do with this. And it was clear this is Tongva land. And I agree with your analysis entirely. It was stunning. And it reminds me of some of the other incidents we've seen where, Black folks who fashioning themselves as radical political actors, like groups like the Republic of New Africa, have said, well, since we were enslaved or descendants of people who were enslaved in the southeastern United States, that territory is going to be our territory for Black liberation going forward. And, Indigenous peoples rightly saying, can we have a conversation about this? As you said, the original theft, the original steward, extremely important.
Yeah, these are
Thank you.
tough conversations, but I know that we can have them. I know that with enough goodwill, we can make progress on that and hear each other and have, equity with each other and have, just allyship. So
100%. I think we have another question from our colleague Elisa Litsi, please.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you so much, Dina, for your presentation. I have many questions. Let's say I would like to go maybe with one maybe a key question that answer all your questions, which is, the title of the journal is a resistant. We talk so much about radical environmental humanities. So I would like to ask you what you think is to be a radical scholar, and I mean, especially in view of the upcoming years in the US with the new presidency, all of the, if you have, an insight, a comment based on your previous experience, your next future, work you intend to do.
Mm,
And thank you so
mm.
much again.
Sure, that's a great question. The term radical has really taken on much different meaning than it used to, right? So I'm a baby boomer. Like that's my generation. I grew up during the counterculture in Southern California, and the term radical was certainly a very central term to describe, the counterculture and this emerging, countercultural sensibility, responding to, rejecting and reacting to the previous generation that was very conservative, very materialistic, very unfulfilling for this new generation of youth. And so this term radical, or even we think about, Black activism, the ethnic national movements, those were considered radical at the time because they were, they came forward from populations who had been so suppressed and silenced that for them to rise up in this way and to voice their perspectives in this very vociferous way, that was considered radical. And so now if we look at the way the term radical is being used and animated, if we think about a radical right-wing populism, like that's another form of radicalism. In our generation and this previous generation, in the use of the term radical, it was it was a point of pride. Like, yeah, we're doing radical scholarship, for all the right reasons. We're this is liberatory. This is, these are liberation projects that we're doing. This new kind of radicalism is not that. This right-wing Christian nationalist fundamentalism or populism is a new type of radicalism that is veering off into fascism. I mean, we have to be really clear about that. I mean, I don't want to be like catastrophize, or which is really easy to do. Um, but to think about where we're at now, there are, large, very loud overtones of fascism that we're being, faced with. And so we need to watch out for that. And fascism is radicalism. So we have to be like, we have new kind of new meanings of the term radical that we need to be clear about.
That's a very good point, by the way. The erosion and appropriation of terms that come from different history, and then someone else appropriated that term without even acknowledge the past of the with new meaning. So it's very important to actually be aware of that. That's a very good point. Thank you. And I think there is another question, David.
Sure. Yes, I think we have time for just one more question. Preeminent environmental historian, feminist scholar Stefania Barca has a question. She asks, I have been fascinated by the work of Winona LaDuke, particularly her book, All Our Relations. Was wondering what you think about it and whether it was connected to that of Momaday.
Yeah, great question. Winona LaDuke's been certainly one of my influences as well. I don't know, and I use that book in some of my teaching. I don't know that there are any connections to Momaday. I'm not aware of that Leduc does any kind of real literary analysis. I could be wrong about that. Maybe she's got some good examples. But nothing comes to mind, and it doesn't mean it's not there. I'm not, a super scholar on Leduc's work, although I'm pretty familiar with it. So, yeah, I don't really have a good answer to that question.
Well, I think it's clear that there's certainly parallels between, say, Leduc's work and your own, just in terms of that broader framework of all our relations. You've gone much deeper, I think, into the political theory, the ethical basis there, and truly amazed at this. I'm looking at the time here, and it looks like we are at the end of our session, unfortunately. So I would just like to say thank you so much to our amazing guest speaker, Dina Gilio-Whitaker, whom I always learn so much from. Every time I read your work and every time I hear you speak, it's a real gift. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Thank you to Litsi Privitera and Nuno Marquez for facilitating. And this, of course, is the third in our speaker series, and we invite you to join us for the rest of this great series, sponsored again by Resistance, a journal of radical environmental humanities. Be well, and thank you all.
Thank you.